January 17, 1991, 2:38 in the morning, Baghdad time. The city is asleep when the first Tomahawk cruise missiles cross into Iraqi airspace, flying low enough to skim the rooftops, guided by digital maps of terrain they have never seen before tonight. Within the next 43 days, 6 different missile systems will fire in anger across this desert. Each of them was designed during the Cold War. Each of them carries inside its circuitry and its steel a specific argument about how wars should be fought. One of these missiles will strike an American barracks in Dhahran and kill 28 soldiers in their sleep. One will land in Tel Aviv and come within a single political decision of breaking the coalition apart. One will cost $1.3 million for a single shot. One will hunt radar stations by listening to them breathe. And one, built in a Soviet design bureau in 1961, will prove that a crude, inaccurate weapon can still shape the outcome of a modern war. The paradox at the heart of this story is simple. The most sophisticated precision weapons ever engineered were about to meet the crudest ballistic missiles still in service, and no one, not in Washington, not in Moscow, not in Baghdad, knew with certainty which doctrine would win. 40 years of rival engineering, 2 philosophies of violence, 1 desert. How did the Cold War's unfinished argument decide the shape of modern warfare in just 43 days? The answer begins not with the missiles themselves, but with the men who designed them, and the fear that taught them what to build. To understand why these 6 weapons existed at all, you have to understand the 40-year argument that produced them. After 1945, 2 superpowers walked away from the ruins of the Second World War carrying different lessons. The Soviets had lost more than 25 million people to a mechanized invasion, and their answer was to build weapons that could throw destruction over vast distances in great numbers without requiring the precision their guidance technology could not yet deliver. Range mattered. Payload mattered. Mobility mattered. Accuracy was a luxury to be solved later. Soviet missile design bureaus produced delivery systems engineered to hurl warheads, often nuclear, at cities, airfields, and rear area concentrations. The goal was not to hit a specific window. The goal was to ensure that something arrived. The Americans learned a different lesson, and they learned it late. Vietnam had exposed the limits of mass bombing. Pilots were being lost to radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. Bombs missed their targets. Political patience collapsed faster than military objectives could be achieved. By the 1970s, American engineers began pivoting toward a new philosophy built on 3 pillars: precision guidance, standoff range, and electronic warfare. Kill the specific thing. Kill it from far away. And do not lose pilots doing it. These 2 philosophies were never supposed to meet in open combat, but Soviet weapons did not stay in Soviet hands. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Moscow exported its missile technology across the developing world, and by 1990, one customer stood above all others. Iraq had become the largest operator of Soviet ballistic missile technology outside the Warsaw Pact itself. Saddam Hussein's arsenal, his launchers, his trained missile brigades, all traced back to Soviet design bureaus. 2 doctrines, 1 desert. They had never fought each other in a real war. Now they would. And the first weapon to prove itself came from the losing side of the Cold War, and it was already 3 decades old. To find the origin of the missile that would terrify the most advanced military coalition in history, you have to rewind to 1958. In a Soviet design bureau, engineers began work on a new tactical ballistic missile, one that could be moved by road, hidden in forests, and fired at NATO rear areas before American air power could respond. The first launch came in 1961. By 1964, it had entered Soviet service under the designation R-17. NATO analysts gave it a simpler name, one that would eventually become synonymous with ballistic terror: Scud-B. The specifications, on paper, were modest: a range of roughly 300 kilometers, a warhead of 985 kilograms capable of carrying conventional explosive, chemical agents, or a tactical nuclear device. A terminal velocity approaching Mach 5, guidance by inertial navigation alone with no mid-course correction and no terminal seeker. The key innovation was not the missile itself, but what carried it. The MAZ-543, a massive 8-wheeled transporter erector launcher, could drive the Scud across open country, stop, erect it, fuel it, and fire it, all from the same vehicle. For the first time, a ballistic missile could be hidden almost anywhere. But the mobility came with a hidden curse. The Scud burned liquid propellants, corrosive and volatile, that could not be stored inside the missile for long. Fueling took nearly an hour on the launch site, and during that hour the vehicle sat exposed, radiating heat, betraying its position to any aircraft overhead. And then there was the accuracy. The Scud's circular error probable, the radius within which half of its shots would land, measured somewhere between 450 and 900 meters. Against a specific building, the missile was almost useless. Against a city, it was devastating. This was a weapon that had never been designed to hit a target. It had been designed to hit a place, and places, unlike buildings, are very hard to miss. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union exported the Scud across its network of client states. Egypt received them, Syria received them, North Korea received them and began building copies. Libya received them. And beginning in the early 1970s, so did Iraq. By the time Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, his forces operated hundreds of Scud missiles and fielded dedicated missile brigades trained by Soviet advisors. Here is the quiet truth buried inside the Scud specifications. It was never designed for accuracy. It was designed for political effect, for the psychological weight of a ballistic missile arriving from nowhere, without warning, against a population that had no way to stop it. And that made it far more dangerous than its circular error probable ever suggested. But even 300 kilometers was not enough for Saddam Hussein. To reach the targets he truly wanted, the missile would have to go further. And so, in a workshop far from any Soviet design bureau, Iraqi engineers did something Moscow had never sanctioned. They cut the Scud open. The decision to modify the Scud was born from desperation. In the mid-1980s, Iraq was locked in a grinding war with Iran, and Saddam Hussein wanted to strike Tehran directly. The problem was geography. Tehran lay roughly 500 kilometers from the nearest Iraqi launch site, and the Scud-B could reach only 300. The Soviets had no intention of selling Iraq a longer-ranged missile. So Iraqi engineers decided to build one themselves, using the only raw material they had in abundance. The Scuds already in their inventory. The method was brutal in its simplicity. Take 3 Scud-B missiles, cut them apart, splice 2 of their fuel tanks into a single elongated airframe stretching the missile's propellant capacity. Shrink the warhead from 985 kilograms down to somewhere between 250 and 500. Reassemble the whole thing into a new weapon. They called it the Al-Hussein. The first test flights came around 1987. By 1988, it was operational, with a reported range of 600 to 650 kilometers, nearly double the original. But the engineering came at a cost the Iraqis could not fully repair. The lengthened airframe was structurally weaker than the original Soviet design. During the stress of re-entry, as the missile plunged back through the atmosphere at hypersonic speed, the Al-Hussein had a tendency to come apart in mid-flight. Warheads tumbled. Debris scattered across wide footprints measured in kilometers rather than meters. By every conventional military standard, this should have been a failure. Instead, it became a feature. An inaccurate missile that broke apart over a city was still a missile arriving over a city. The debris field itself spread fear across entire neighborhoods rather than concentrating damage on a single block. Civilians could not know, as the air raid sirens sounded, whether the incoming warhead would strike a kilometer to the north or a kilometer to the south. The fear covered everything. In January and February of 1991, Iraq launched roughly 88 ballistic missiles, the overwhelming majority of them Al-Hussein variants, at targets in Saudi Arabia and Israel. The military damage was modest. The political damage was almost catastrophic. Missiles falling on Tel Aviv and Haifa put the Israeli government under enormous pressure to retaliate. And if Israel entered the war, the Arab members of the coalition, Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, would almost certainly walk out. The entire military operation that the United States had spent 6 months assembling could unravel on the basis of a single Iraqi launch. The coalition now faced a problem no Air Force had ever truly solved. How do you shoot down a missile with another missile? The answer had been designed 22 years earlier in an American laboratory for an entirely different threat, and it was about to make its combat debut under the eye of a global television audience. The Patriot did not begin its life as a missile defense system. In 1969, American engineers began designing what would become the MIM-104, a surface-to-air weapon intended to replace the aging Nike Hercules and Hawk batteries that had defended Western Europe throughout the 1960s. Full-scale development started in 1976. The system entered service in 1981 and reached initial operational capability around 1984. For its first decade, the Patriot was an anti-aircraft weapon, pure and simple. It was designed to shoot down Soviet bombers and fighter bombers, not ballistic missiles falling from the edge of space. The shift came in the late 1980s as intelligence analysts watched the proliferation of Scud-class weapons accelerate across the developing world. Engineers developed upgrade packages designated Pack-1 and Pack-2 that gave the Patriot a limited capability against tactical ballistic missiles. The hardware remained largely the same. A phased array radar swept the sky. A track-via missile guidance system relayed data between the battery and the interceptor in flight. The missile itself flew at speeds exceeding Mach 3, closing on its target with a proximity-fused warhead designed to detonate nearby and shred the incoming threat with fragmentation. In January 1991, the Patriot became a television star. Grainy night vision footage of interceptions played in loop on CNN. The Bush administration cited a kill rate of 41 out of 42. American and Israeli audiences watched bright streaks climb into the desert sky and detonate, and they believed they were watching the future of warfare being born in real time. Then came the dissonance. In the months after the war, independent analysts began examining the same footage with different eyes. A team at MIT, led by physicist Theodore Postol, studied intercept geometries, impact patterns on the ground, and the physics of what actually happens when a Patriot meets a tumbling Al-Hussein traveling at hypersonic speed. Their conclusion was uncomfortable. The warhead kill rate, the rate at which Patriots actually destroyed the lethal portion of an incoming missile, was closer to 0 to 40%. Many of the televised intercepts were Patriots chasing tumbling debris from Al-Husseins that had already broken apart during re-entry. The Patriot was hitting something. It was not always hitting the thing that mattered. And then, on the night of February 25, 1991, the argument became lethal. A Patriot battery at Dhahran had been operating continuously for days. A software drift in the system's internal clock, accumulating fractions of a second over every hour of operation, caused the radar's tracking gate to misalign. When an incoming Al-Hussein entered the battery's engagement zone, the system failed to track it. No interceptor was launched. The warhead struck an American barracks housing soldiers of the 14th Quartermaster Detachment. 28 were killed, 98 were wounded. It remains the single deadliest incident suffered by American forces in the entire war. The paradox is difficult to reconcile, but it is essential to the story of this war. The Patriot's technical performance was disputed, contested, and in places clearly flawed. Yet its strategic performance was decisive. The simple fact of its presence over Israeli cities gave the Israeli government enough political cover to hold its fire. The coalition survived. Whatever the physics of interception revealed, the geopolitics of deployment had worked. While the Patriots defended the rear, something very different was unfolding 500 miles to the south, out over the dark water of the Persian Gulf. The coalition was not only defending, it was attacking. And it was doing so with a weapon no navy in history had ever used in combat before. Return to the opening hours of Desert Storm. From warships positioned in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and from submarines including the USS Louisville, firing from beneath the surface, the first salvos of the air campaign were not flown by pilots. They were launched by sailors pressing buttons, watching green symbols on consoles, as 288 BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles rose from their launch tubes and turned toward Baghdad. The Tomahawk was a weapon 2 decades in the making. Development began in the 1970s, driven by a simple question inside the American defense establishment. How do you strike a heavily defended target deep inside enemy territory without risking the life of a pilot? The answer that emerged was a subsonic cruise missile, roughly 20 feet long, powered by a small turbofan engine, capable of flying at altitudes low enough to slip beneath most radar coverage. It entered service between 1983 and 1984. By January 1991, it was ready for its first war. The technology that guided it was unlike anything that had come before. A system called TERCOM, short for Terrain Contour Matching, carried a digital map of the ground along the missile's planned route. As the Tomahawk flew, a radar altimeter read the contours of the land below and compared them in real time to the stored map. Deviations were corrected automatically. Over the final approach to the target, a second system called DSMAC, Digital Scene Matching Area Correlation, took over. It carried reference photographs of the target area, compared them to what its camera actually saw, and refined the missile's aim point down to within a handful of meters. The range was extraordinary. Depending on the variant, a Tomahawk could fly between 700 and 1,350 nautical miles. The warhead was a unitary conventional charge designed to penetrate hardened structures. The price tag was roughly $1.3 million for each missile fired, a cost that would have been unthinkable for any earlier generation of munition, but one the United States was now willing to pay. The targets on that first night were chosen to paralyze: Iraqi command and control bunkers in central Baghdad, presidential facilities, power generation plants that fed the integrated air defense grid, radar sites, communications nodes. The opening blow of the war was designed to blind Saddam Hussein before he could even understand that the war had begun, and no American pilot flew into Baghdad that night. The most defended airspace on Earth outside of Moscow itself was struck first by machines. The doctrinal rupture this represented is difficult to overstate. For every major war of the 20th century, the opening hours had belonged to manned bombers, to pilots accepting the risk of death in exchange for the precision only a human could provide. The Tomahawk ended that era. From this night forward, the first night of every major war the United States would fight would belong, at least in part, to unmanned precision strikes launched from hundreds of miles away. But Tomahawks alone could not win the sky. Iraq still operated one of the densest integrated air defense networks in the world, a lattice of radar stations feeding targeting data to surface-to-air missile batteries across the country. Before any coalition pilot could fly safely into Iraqi airspace, those radars had to die. And they would be killed in the days and weeks that followed by a missile that hunted them by listening. If there is an unsung weapon in the story of the Gulf War, a missile whose contribution was decisive but rarely celebrated, it is the AGM-88 HARM. The name is an acronym: High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile. Its purpose was singular, and its logic, once you understand it, reframes the entire air campaign. Development began in the 1970s and accelerated through the early 1980s, driven by the same lesson that had shaped so much of American weapons design in that era. Pilots flying into heavily defended airspace were being killed by radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. The older generation of anti-radar weapons, the Shrikes and the Standard Arms, were slow, short-ranged, and easily defeated by an operator who simply switched his radar off before the missile could reach him. Engineers needed something faster, something smarter, something that could punish the act of radiating, whether the operator kept his set on or not. Full production was approved in 1983. The HARM reached initial operational capability with the United States Navy in 1985 and with the Air Force in 1987. The weapon itself was built around a single idea: kill the thing that sees you. Its seeker was passive. It did not emit anything. It simply listened across a wide band of radio frequencies for the distinctive signature of enemy radar. When it detected a target, it locked on and rode the signal back to its source at speeds exceeding Mach 2 across distances reaching 80 nautical miles or more. And if the enemy operator, sensing his death, shut his radar down in the final seconds, the HARM had an answer for that too. A memory mode stored the last known coordinates of the emitter and continued the attack against that point on the ground, regardless of whether the target kept radiating. In the Gulf War, coalition aircraft fired more than 2,000 HARMs. The platforms that carried them read like a catalog of Cold War air power. The F-4G Wild Weasel, a specialized variant built specifically for the radar hunting mission, the F-16, and the F/A-18 Hornet. The effect of this weapon on Iraqi air defense was not merely tactical. It was doctrinal. Iraqi radar operators learned, within days, that turning on their set for more than a few seconds was a death sentence. The rational response, once word spread across the network, was to stop emitting altogether. And the moment an air defense radar stops emitting, it also stops seeing. A missile battery without radar cannot engage. An early warning network that cannot radiate cannot warn. The HARM did not only kill individual radars, it killed the willingness of an entire air defense system to function. This is the true turning point of the war, the pivot on which everything else swings. Without the HARM, the skies over Iraq remain lethal. Tomahawks launched into that airspace risk interception. Follow-on strike packages face radar-guided missiles at every turn. Coalition sorties take casualties measured in dozens rather than handfuls. The entire air campaign that the world watched on television, with its almost surreally low loss rates, rested on the silent work of a missile that killed radars by listening to them. Soviet doctrine had been built around masked, radar-guided air defense. American doctrine answered with a weapon that made the operation of that radar suicidal. By the time the air campaign entered its second week, the Iraqi integrated air defense system was not so much destroyed as it was paralyzed, afraid to switch itself on. The skies were empty. The radars were silent. It was time now to hunt the Iraqi army itself, and for that mission, the coalition had one last Cold War weapon, one designed years earlier for exactly this purpose, that would turn the open desert into a graveyard of armor. The AGM-65 Maverick had been in American service since August of 1972, a weapon born from the same post-Vietnam reckoning that produced so much of the precision arsenal the coalition now carried into Iraq. Its design problem was specific and unforgiving. How do you hit a tank from the air without forcing the pilot to loiter directly above it while enemy gunners take their time? The Maverick's answer was a fire-and-forget guidance system that allowed the aircraft to launch from standoff range and turn away immediately, leaving the missile to find the target on its own. The weapon evolved into a family. Early variants carried an electro-optical television seeker suited to clear daylight conditions. Later versions adopted infrared imaging, which allowed the missile to hunt by the heat signature of an engine block even in darkness or light obscuration. laser-guided variants were developed for designators held by forward controllers on the ground or by a second aircraft overhead. At the heart of every version sat a 57-kilogram shaped charge warhead, purpose-built to defeat the composite and steel armor of Soviet-designed tanks, the same tanks that now sat dug in across Kuwait and southern Iraq. In 43 days of combat, coalition aircraft fired more than 5,000 Mavericks. The platforms that delivered them formed the backbone of the close air support and anti-armor campaign. The A-10 Warthog, slow and heavily armored and built around its 30mm cannon, could carry 6 Mavericks at a time and hunt armored columns across open desert. The F-16, the FA-18 Hornet, and the AV-8B Harrier all added their own contributions. Reported hit rates fell between 60 and 90%, an accuracy figure without precedent in the history of air-to-ground warfare. The climax came on Highway 80, as Iraqi forces began their retreat from Kuwait City in the final days of February. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks, stolen civilian cars funneled onto the coastal road heading north toward Basra. Coalition aircraft caught them in the open. Mavericks and cluster munitions rained down across miles of stalled vehicles. The road became known almost immediately as the Highway of Death. The war had begun with unmanned precision strikes against bunkers hidden inside a sleeping capital. It ended with precision strikes against a defeated, fleeing army on an open road. The Cold War's great unanswered question, whether precision could defeat mass, had just been answered in scorched metal stretching to the horizon. Pull back now and look at the whole shape of it. 6 weapons, 2 philosophies, 43 days of combat that compressed 4 decades of engineering rivalry into a single, legible answer. The Americans proved across those 6 weeks that precision, standoff range, and electronic warfare could collapse the timeline of a modern war from years into weeks. The Tomahawk opened the skies without risking pilots. The HARM silenced the radars that would have killed those pilots. The Maverick destroyed the armored force on which Iraqi ground doctrine had rested. Together, these 3 weapons created the template that every serious military on Earth has spent the decades since trying to copy. Precision strike doctrine, cruise missile arsenals, dedicated suppression of enemy air defenses. All of it traces back, in operational terms, to what happened in this desert. But the Scud and the Al-Hussein proved something equally permanent and in some ways more troubling. A crude, inaccurate ballistic missile built on 1961 technology and modified in Iraqi workshops could still dictate the political shape of a war. It could force a superpower coalition to redirect thousands of sorties into desperate Scud hunts across western Iraq. It could nearly fracture an international alliance with a single warhead landing in Tel Aviv. Military insignificance and political significance, it turned out, were not the same thing. The Patriot's contested performance revealed the hardest truth of all. The perception of defense can matter as much as the reality of it. The interceptor did not need to work perfectly to work strategically. It needed only to hold Israel inside the coalition, and in that narrow task, whatever the physics, it succeeded. Every missile crisis since 1991 has been fought between these 2 inherited doctrines. The weapons are still here, the argument is still unresolved, and the desert is still listening.